Next on American History TV's The Presidency. This November 22nd marks 49 years since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in shooting the president. Oswald was himself shot and killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby. Numerous other theories have persisted since 1963. Now, a panel of historians talk about what they think happened in Dallas. This 2-hour program was part of the Mid-America Conference on History in Springfield, Missouri.
Well, welcome. It's wonderful to be the moderator for the Mid-America Conference on History session dealing with the Kennedy assassination with really 4 of the leading lights who have been trying to get us to understand what is the biggest murder mystery in U.S. history. It's fitting that we're here with, and the founder of this conference, James Giglio, has written the seminal book that we use in colleges on the presidency of John F. Kennedy, part of the University of Kansas Press's a series on the presidency, and it's a book he constantly updates. So James, thank you for doing that. And I also might add, this is very timely. Unlike a lot of history topics, I don't have to explain to you what the Kennedy assassination was, nor probably do I have to remind you, but I will, that we are rapidly coming upon the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in November of 2013. I suspect you're going to be seeing a lot of talk about 50 years later, because like Pearl Harbor or 9/11, it's one of those moments that anybody alive that's still alive today that was alive in '63 has it's the moment they heard about the news, and people have stories, and it's endlessly fascinating. Already books are coming out this November by popular television host and a scholar dealing with the Kennedy assassination. I think we'll find more and more. So we're very lucky to have these scholars here today. The protocol we're going to do is I'm going to call them up one at a time according to the program order. They're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes max to talk. Then after all 4 have their say, I'm going to go back in the same order and allow each gentleman 20 minutes. I'm sorry, 10 minutes. And at that point, I might ask a couple of questions, and then we'd like to open it up to Q&A from the audience. We have, as you can tell from the program, 2-hour session here, so we should be able to get at some of the questions. All of us wonder what happened. All of us are fascinated about the Warren Commission and Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. I, in a previous talk today, spoke on Walter Cronkite and how people absorbed the assassination via television. There are just hundreds of thousands of different ways to look at this tragic event. And let's begin. I'm going to call up Gerald McKnight of Hood College. He's author of Breach of Trust, How the Warren Commission Failed the Nation and Why. And this is an ongoing inquiry for him. He's working on a manuscript right now, a new book dealing with the Kennedy assassination for Kansas. So please, Professor McKnight.
Thank you for coming, and I hope it's going to be worthwhile. I'll try to do the best I can. I want to begin this way. Actually, what I'm going to do is, in brief overview, is to try to give you a sense of Lee Harvey Oswald's last 45 hours on Earth, okay? Now, to begin with, I just want to begin this way, and that is to try to make as clear as I possibly can how quickly Oswald was put in the frame, okay? As the assassin of the president, the assassin of Officer Tippit, and the man who wounded Governor Connolly. Now, some of this would be would have been very interesting in some ways. Although I don't have specific information, but we do have accounts, for example, of the Kennedy cabinet people who were, for example, on an airplane and were heading to Tokyo for a conference. Back in Washington, there were only 4 cabinet people left there. McNamara was one, Bobby Kennedy was another, and then there was the Gronsky and another fellow, minor figures. The rest of them were scattered across the world. Now those in the Air Force plane that was heading toward Tokyo for a conference, that included the Secretary of State, his assistant Robert Manning, Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, were in that plane. Accounts of these people tell us that while they were in that plane, what they don't tell us is the time, is that they were alerted to the fact that the president had been shot. Not only had he been shot, but they were also told that the one who shot him was Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been to the Soviet Union, and he had done this. Now, I wish lovely to know exactly what time that happened. The president, as you know, in terms of Central Standard Time, was killed about 12:31. I think is when he was shot, 12:31. Declared dead at about 1:10, something like that. Pierre Salinger, though, in writing his account, also contributed to the Kennedy Library a manuscript, and in that manuscript he indicated the time on that plane they learned about this information. That manuscript is in Harvard. I went up there. It is missing. It is gone. Nobody knows where it is. Back in Washington, D.C., things happened rather quickly. At 3:40 Central Standard Time, Abram Chavez, State Department legal counsel, received a call from Acting Secretary of State George Ball with directions to gather, quote, together the files in the department on Oswald, on Lee Harvey Oswald. That was at 3:40 Central Standard Time. He then tasked Mr. Chavez to be sure that he had on his desk the next morning a report on what the State Department had on Lee Harvey Oswald. Now we get to the more specific indicators now of how fast this thing developed. At 12:45 Central Standard Time, 15 minutes after the shooting, a Dallas lieutenant inspector by the name of J.H. Sawyer, with 23 years in the department, was on the police radio with a description of the shooter. That is in the that source there is in the FBI Lee Harvey Oswald file, and the description came this way: he was a white male, approximately 30 years of age, slender built, 5'10" and about 165 pounds. Well, that wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, and that he had a rifle, and that it looked like a .30-30 type Winchester, but no description on what he was wearing. So my question would be, that's interesting, because if you become that specific and then cannot describe what he's wearing, it suggests you didn't know what he was going to be wearing getting up that morning before the event occurred. That's an indication of something that would require, I think, clutching at this issue again and thinking it through. But we'll leave it go at that. But what is equally more interesting is that Sawyer, a 23-year veteran on the police force, never was able, the source gave him that. He said somebody came up and told him that. But he never got the source's name. 23 years in the Dallas Police Department, and he never got the source's name. Now, Oswald, at this particular time, was 24 years old. He weighed 131 pounds. And according to Dr. Rose, who did his autopsy, he was 5'9" in height. Okay, so when he died, when he was killed himself on Sunday, those were his vitals. He had no description like that on the top. Although there is, interestingly enough, there was a CIA file. They had several files on Oswald. One was called the Lee Henry Oswald file, and in that file, the dimensions you get for this fellow, for the Lee Harvey Oswald in this file, was that he was 165 pounds, he was about 30 years old, and he was about 5'10". That's sort of interesting. If anybody was asked me about that later, maybe I can explain that at a little bit more length. The first, I'm not sure of this, and I won't say it. I'd ask Dave Kaiser about it. I think some indication that maybe the first time the American people heard of Lee Harvey Oswald, his name, it may have been from Walter Cronkite, who was broadcasting at that time, but I may have to go back and wait till David Kaiser is able to nail that down. I don't know. In any event, so that is just simply an opening, setting up, I think, the spirit of the times. Now, what happened here next was it was absolutely important to find out that this description of the shooter that Sawyer got, that description of the shooter came from a physical source. And so, while Sawyer could not satisfy us in terms of the name of the person who gave him this description, very quickly that name will surface, and it'll be the name of Mr. Brennan. He is the commissioned star witness for placing Oswald in the frame for shooting JFK, Governor Connally. Even though, as I will go on a little bit more, even though the Warren Commission had no credible evidence ever that Brennan was ever able to pick Oswald out of a lineup, and I'll explain a little bit of that a little bit later as I move ahead here. Now, but even more specifically, and this is a document I don't think has been revealed yet, in terms of putting Oswald in the frame. Before any police had any forensic evidence against Oswald, at 1:40 on 11/22, Oswald was pronounced, JFK was pronounced dead about 30 minutes before this. An arrest report cited Oswald as the man, quote, the man who shot and killed President John F. Kennedy, police officer Tippit. He also shot and wounded. Governor Connally. And if anybody wants to see this document, I have it up here. It's a 62109060. That's a main JFK file. 2074 evidence behind file. And here it is. And the date of this is the date of this police report is 1:40 p.m. Central Standard Time. That is 20 minutes after JFK was pronounced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. In 20 minutes, they've got Oswald, and they've got him in the frame already. That's wonderful. That is extraordinary police work. I'm not sure when Oswald was arrested in the Texas theater, but it wasn't. It may have been after this. I'm not sure, and I have to apologize for that. I have to go back and try to check that out. Well, as it occurred, since they needed an explanation for the identification of Oswald that Sawyer then broadcast over the police radio, they needed a witness, and Howard Brennan becomes that witness. Now, the 2 points about Brennan, and I could spend a lot of time on Mr. Brennan. The 2 points. There is no firm evidence that Brennan ever was present at a lineup and picked Oswald out of the lineup. Brennan makes that claim in time. He will make that claim in a book that will be published 4 years after his death, that he in fact did pick Oswald out of a lineup on 11/22. But there is, and that's in a book that he had. It was published posthumously in a book called Eyewitness to History, is where he states that. But if you go through the laborious work of going through the documentation, The most dramatic rejection of that comes when Captain Fritz, we'll say a little bit more about Fritz in a minute, Captain Fritz, who was really sort of running the show down there, was questioned by Commissioner McCloy, John McCloy, of the Warren Commission, about was he there at the time of the lineup when Brennan actually pointed to Oswald as the man he allegedly saw in the 6th floor southeast corner window with a rifle and discharging that rifle at the President of the United States. And when he is confronted, when confronted with that, Fritz could not answer McCloy. He said, "Well, I don't even remember if I was at that questioning." He just flubbed it away. It was so clear that he found himself in an embarrassing situation that McCloy dropped the questioning. Anybody who's interested, if you have the Warren Commission report, go to the 4th volume 4H, page 227, and check it out yourself. Brennan's testimony was worthless. It was staged, rehearsed, and was privately rejected by the FBI and the Warren Commission behind the scenes. Now, 2 important points I think would follow here. Number 1 is another man who appears on the scene on 11/22 is a fellow by the name of Charles Leslie Bronson. Bronson was an engineer. He was in Daly Plaza on 11/22. He was taking pictures of the presidential motorcade as it came off Houston and then turned onto Elm. And about a little bit, by maybe 5 minutes maybe before Kennedy and the limousine turned onto Elm, he had a new camera, and he was panning in on what had been the area where he would get a picture of the motorcade. But this was a new camera, and so he was getting even more than that. He was getting the entire Texas School Book Depository building and the 6th floor. He had about 94 exposures of that 6th floor window, southeast corner. It is the only window that is open on the 6th floor. It is the alleged assassin's lair, where Oswald is waiting for the president. 94 exposures. He turned that information, those pictures, over to the FBI, if not the 22nd, the 23rd. The local FBI people looked at it and returned it back to him and reported it didn't. His film did not even show the Texas School Book Depository. The word for that came from headquarters. Bury that film, which they did with dispatch. If you want a little bit more of that, it's in breach of trust. I have it in breach of trust. On December 1963. On December 1963, after Oswald was dead, this whole official solution to the crime was already now put together and resolved, quote unquote. A couple of FBI agents back in Washington, D.C. took a look at the Bronson film. And now that the political issue is now over, it's resolved, there's no problem with it. What they found out here, and this is a document, if you'd like to take a look at it, I'll just show it to you. They found that the corner window on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building, shown in Bronson film, showed no images that could be interpreted as individuals who were found in any of these exposures. The pictures do show an outline of what may be interpreted as boxes, and were later behind the window. Now, they didn't stop there. They took the Bronson films, and then they shuffled them off to the U.S. Navy Photographic Interpretation Center at Suitland, Maryland, which is probably one of the best in the world at that time. And the guys down there took a look at it and reported the same thing. There's nobody in that window. Nobody in the sniper's window. They're just simply images of book boxes, which is what was up on the sixth floor. That, of course, is after the whole case has been closed. Did Oswald fire a weapon that day? Well, very quickly, I would just simply say this. Once again, I'm using FBI documents. In September of '64, the Warren report was finished. It may have not gone public yet, but it was finished. It was in the printer's hands. And sometime, I don't know if the date is terribly important here, but Mr. Rankin, who was the chief counsel for the Warren Commission, got a request. A request came from an individual, Stuart Wolpert, who was head of productions of some large movie company, and he was going to put out a movie, a documentary called 4 Days in November. And in doing that, he got to Rankin, and he said, could you run this manuscript past the FBI to make sure there are no errors in the manuscript? And Rankin got to Hoover, and Hoover said, oh, he was reluctant, but he said, okay, go ahead. And so in examining the manuscript, went into the hands of Mr. Belmont, who really was running the investigation. I think you have to appreciate it this time. Hoover was right on the edge of retirement. He was taking afternoons off, napping, that kind of thing. He was not exactly on top of the evidence, but he was interested in terms of the political question here, and that is that Oswald did it, they caught him, and that's the end of the situation. So Belmont takes a look at the transcript. I'm sure he would rather have done other things, but since Hoover said go ahead and do it and get Rankin off my back. When it comes to the question here, the question that was raised about Oswald, there's a section in the film, in the transcript, about Oswald, being the shooter that day and having shot at the president. Belmont says this is FBI Belmont. He said, this is erroneous, as that these tests, the paraffin tests, were essentially negative, and our laboratory experts have so testified before the President's Commission. I don't know where that was. In addition, highly technical examinations made by the Atomic Energy Commission in our laboratory on the paraffin tests cannot connect Oswald with the rifle. Cannot connect Oswald with the rifle. Now that's FBI, okay? That's internal FBI situation here.
Give a minute more. So
okay. Well, a minute more. All I can say is this: is that Oswald, when he was in the hands of the police, he was interrogated, I think 8 times under interrogation on those 3 days. Lineups, all that sort of thing. Under those circumstances, there is not a record, other than a record of those interrogations of what was said and what did Oswald respond to. Here is the crime of the century. And the individual who's held responsible for killing the president and the policeman, Mr. Tippit, and wounding Connolly, not a word. Except we do remember that at one time when he was brought through police headquarters, they said, "Did you kill the president?" He said, "No, I'm just a patsy. I'm just a patsy." So we have a situation here, and the Warren Commission had to ask, what kind of record did you keep of this exchange? And Captain Fritz, who was in charge of this, he said, we didn't have a tape recorder. The Dallas police, okay, they got 170 men on the force. We didn't have a tape recorder. He said, I put in requisitions twice, 2 years in a row for a tape recorder, and they denied them to me. And stenographic records, there was a stenographer there, but no stenographic records. Warren Commission found no problem with that at all. But what we do know here, and I have documentation, I'd be glad to show it to you, is that on 11/24, that's Sunday, Oswald is killed in the basement after warnings that there was going to be an attempt on his life. Warnings came early Sunday morning to the FBI, to the sheriff's office, and to the Dallas cops. He still, instead of moving him out in the evening, a warning came, and two people said to him, "We don't want to cause any problems. We're going to kill the son of a bitch, and so just allow yourself to be reconciled to that fact." Now, all we ended up with then, at that time, were 2 sheets of paper written by Captain Fritz on these 7 or 8 interrogations. That's all that was left at the time of the assassination. And let me just end with this: as soon as Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered on Sunday, just by those warnings. I mean, the biggest Latin American country in the world. Here he is, surrounded by all these cops, 170 news people. Jack Ruby comes in and bumps him off. As soon as that happened, the Secret Service grabbed a hold of Marina Oswald and her 2 children, and they took her to a safe spot where they then, after dinner, interrogated her. It's on tape for 7 hours. Now, was the Secret Service in on the interrogations? Of course. Did they have a tape recorder available? Of course. What has happened to all that information? It's all gone. All gone. We don't know that at all. So, anyway, those are some indication of Lee Harvey Oswald's last 44 hours on Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McKnight. Next up is David Kaiser, who has taught history at Harvard, Carnegie Mellon, the Naval War College, and Williams College, where he currently holds the Stanley Kaplan Visiting Professorship. He is the author of numerous articles and 6 books, including American Tragedy, Kennedy, Johnson, and the Origins of the Vietnam War, and The Road to Dallas, the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, which he's brought with us so we can see. And I'd like to call up David.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you, Jim, for the courageous act of putting together this panel. I'm going to start with a couple of brief remarks about the historiography of the case so I can let you know where I fit in. For the last nearly half-century, the discussion of the assassination has been dominated by 2 schools of thought, or, if you will, 2 faiths. And I'm going to very briefly describe each of them and how they approach the evidence in the case. To begin with, there's the Church of the Lone Assassin, whose adherents insist that both Oswald and Ruby were essentially lone nuts who murdered John Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald, respectively, for their own personal reasons. And because they believe this, the adherents of this church respond to any evidence of conspiracy in the same way: it must be false. Now, in any complex case, and this is a very complex case, one can always find some reason to disbelieve any piece of evidence if that's what you want to do. And indeed, that is how trial lawyers make their living. And thus, members of the Church of the Lone Assassin always find some way to disregard any evidence of conspiracy. May I say that on one critical point, they are, in my opinion, correct. There is massive evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald did shots that struck John Connally and President Kennedy, that he did kill Kennedy, and that he was the only actual killer, and that was clearly demonstrated in various ways by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s. But on why Oswald and Ruby did what they did, I part company with the Church of the Lone Assassin. Now, on the other hand, on the other side, we have the Church of the Grand Conspiracy. And their adherents are frequently rather vague about exactly what they think did happen and who was responsible, but they are absolutely convinced that there was a very large conspiracy, usually involving figures within the U.S. government, and a massive cover-up. Many of them argue that Oswald was innocent, or at least that he may have been. And their approach to the evidence is just as simple. Any discrepancy in the evidence, any apparent lack of evidence, Any evidence that isn't there that they think should be is to them conclusive proof of both conspiracy and cover-up. And since, once again, in a complex case like this, many discrepancies are inevitable, they have plenty to work with, too. May I say that both faiths are very ably represented on this panel, but I do not happen to belong to either one. Now, I first became involved in this as a scholar on the 20th anniversary when I was commissioned to write a long piece for the Sunday section of the Washington Post about the assassination. And at that time, I took an agnostic position on the key issues, but I was already quite impressed by the conclusions of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, namely that the president was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy involving organized crime figures. For the rest of the 80s and the 90s, I wrote books on other topics, but then in the 90s, thanks to the JFK Records Act, we had a massive, unprecedented, and probably never to be repeated release of documents from the FBI, from the CIA, and from the Assassinations Committee, and that was an opportunity I could not resist. And I went into that archive beginning in 2001, determined to find out what I could about the broader context within which the assassination took place. I haven't read more of that archive than any person I know, but I think I did, with the help of some assistants, read more of it than any author. And here are my conclusions, which are similar to, but much more specific than, those of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. President Kennedy was killed by a conspiracy of leading organized crime figures, including, certainly, Sandro Trafficante, the mob boss of North Florida, who had previously owned many of the casinos in Havana, Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, and very possibly, though not certainly, Sam Giancana of Chicago. Those mobsters were part of a broad network, including not only mob bosses, but many anti-Castro Cuban refugees, American mercenaries who worked with those refugees, and American right-wing activists, some of them leading business figures. In saying that, I want to make it very clear that I am not saying that everyone in the network was involved in the assassination. It is only certain organized crime figures who can be directly tied to it. There are plenty of suspects among the other groups, but nothing conclusive, and actually I think it was a relatively small group that actually knew what was up. That network had been formed during the Batista era in Cuba, when American mobsters were busily turning Havana into the Las Vegas of the East Coast. After Castro took power, it shifted its base of operations to the US and began to focus on Castro's overthrow. And Miami, New Orleans, and Dallas were all centers of network activity of many ways, of many kinds. Crucially, the network was enlisted in 1960 by the Central Intelligence Agency under the Eisenhower administration to assassinate Fidel Castro. Three major mob figures, Trafficante, Giancana, and Marcello, were involved in that effort, and as I have said, at least two of them were later involved in the assassination of JFK. I also do not believe, by the way, that anybody from the CIA was involved in the assassination, although CIA people worked with key figures of the in the network all the time on the assassination of Castro in particular. Now, the motive for the assassination was Robert Kennedy's all-out attack on organized crime. This had become the major crusade of Robert Kennedy's life in the 50s when he was the counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee, and it was his absolute top priority as Attorney General. Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana were among his major targets. He came into office in January, and by April, Marcello, thanks to Robert Kennedy, had been deported from the United States, kidnapped basically New Orleans and deported, although he managed to sneak back into the country a few months later. Kennedy then started a prosecution of Marcello for having submitted false documentation, and that prosecution, believe it or not, ended with Marcello's acquittal in New Orleans on the morning of November 22nd, 1963. Sam Giancana was another leading target who was ceaselessly harassed by the FBI and who the Justice Department thought they had nailed on a wiretapping charge involving his girlfriend, the singer Phyllis McGuire, in 1962. But Robert Kennedy was appalled to discover that he was going to have to drop that charge because of Giancana's involvement in the CIA assassination plot against Castro. Now both Marcello and Trafficante were also major allies of Jimmy Hoffa, Kennedy's other major target. And indeed, in May 1963, Hoffa sent Frank Regano, a Florida lawyer who worked for both Hoffa and Trafficante, to meet with Marcello and Trafficante in New Orleans and to tell them that the time had come to kill John Kennedy. Now, you may be wondering why kill John Kennedy and not Robert Kennedy, and in fact, it turns out that they had thought about that rather carefully and reached a sensible conclusion. Were they to kill Robert Kennedy, there was a grave danger that the president would send the Army and Marines after them in revenge. But if they killed the president, Lyndon Johnson would take over. Everyone knew that he and Robert Kennedy were, to put it mildly, not close. And RFK would lose his influence and probably his job, and some of the heat would come off. And that is, in fact, exactly what did happen in the years immediately after the assassination. Meanwhile, many anti-Castro Cubans and their American supporters were increasingly angry at President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis had failed to result in the removal of Fidel Castro. And by 1963, right-wing anti-Castro Cubans and their American allies, all this is detailed at great length in my book, were convinced either that JFK would never do anything against Fidel Castro, or that, if he did, he would replace him with another relatively left-wing Cuban leader from the exile community who wouldn't be any more to their liking either. And as a matter of fact, about that, they were absolutely right. That was the goal towards which the administration and the CIA were working during 1963. However, although there are certain anti-Castro groups and individual figures who have been linked to the assassination and who certainly are logical suspects, there is no one about whom I can definitely say that they were involved. Now, what about Oswald and Ruby? And I want to stress that in the limited time I have, I'm only giving you very key facts, and if there are things you want me to elaborate on, please let me do so later on. Well, Oswald had connections to the Marcello mob going back to his childhood in New Orleans. He had an uncle whom he reestablished contact with in 1963, who was a bookmaker in the Marcello organization, and his mother also consorted with men who were part of that organization. I am also convinced, as I explain at length in the book, that after Oswald returned from the Soviet Union in 1962, he somehow became involved with right-wing activists in Dallas and New Orleans, and in fact became part of an ongoing FBI COINTELPRO effort to discredit the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which I discovered was definitely going on at that time. And that is what his phony chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans was about. Again, I am not suggesting that Oswald was being directed personally by anybody in the FBI. Much of the COINTEL program was subcontracted, indeed, to private right-wing groups, and that, I think, was what was happening in this case. I am also convinced that when, after the Fair Play for Cuba Committee episode, Oswald went to Mexico City in September of 1963 to try to get into Cuba, he was trying to get into Cuba to make yet another assassination attempt on Fidel Castro. One of my major findings, by the way, is that the assassination plots against Castro run by the CIA and others were much more numerous than had been revealed by the investigations in the 1970s. When Oswald couldn't get into Cuba because he couldn't get to Mexico, he went back to Dallas, and he got the assignment to kill JFK instead. As for Ruby, he had been associated with mob figures all his life, and his strip club was undoubtedly a mob-controlled enterprise. Dallas, in the organized crime world, was a subsidiary of New Orleans, where Carlos Marcello was the boss. Ruby talked for months before the assassination about all the trouble he was having with the American Guild of Variety Artists, the union to which his strippers belonged. Even though there was an investigation of that union that year, most people haven't understood what he was talking about. That union did absolutely nothing for the young women who belonged to it except collect dues. It was a mob-controlled outfit that existed for the purpose of extorting money from club owners, like Ruby. In other words, Ruby was short in his payments to his mob bosses. He didn't know what to do, and this left him in a vulnerable position. But I now am going to go to the key evidence in the conspiracy itself. The critical figure in making the assassination happen was an associate of the Trafficante family named John Martino. He had worked in Havana casinos for Trafficante. He was arrested in Havana in 1959 for trying to smuggle some of Trafficante's money out, although he was charged with something else, and he was sentenced to a long prison term. Somehow, he managed to get out of prison in 1962. At that time, by the way, in 1959, Trafficante was also in a detention camp in Cuba, and he received a visit in September of 1959 in that camp from none other than Jack Ruby, who had made a short trip to Havana at that time. When Martino got out of prison and returned to Florida in 1962, he immediately became very active in the whole network again. He acquired a right-wing ghostwriter, Nathan Weil, and he wrote a book called I Was Castro's Prisoner. And then in May of 1963, he organized, with the help of the Miami CIA station and staffers of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, and William Pauley, a industrialist, a transportation magnate also, yet another assassination attempt on Castro, which was known as the Bio-Pauley Raid. And according to a mercenary named Loren Hall, who we'll come back to, who was also in the detention camp with Trafficante in 1959, both Sam Giancana and Trafficante were involved in financing that raid. It was sold to the CIA with a cover story involving potential Soviet defectors, but it is clear that it was designed to send a group into Cuba with some equipment to try to blow up Fidel. As it happened, the boat that they sent apparently sank, and the men never reached Cuba. Martino then went on a book tour promoting his book, visiting both New Orleans and Dallas in September and around October 1st of 1963. And 3 weeks later, he went back to Dallas for reasons that have never been explained. We then come to Loren Hall, the mercenary I just mentioned, who had been involved in the planning of the Bio-Pauley raid, and he was also in Dallas with another man, Larry Howard, in late September and early October of 1963. This was one of a number of trips that Hall made to Dallas in 1963, usually to raise money for anti-Castro Cuban activities. On October 3rd, I can now say with greater certainty than I did in the book, a left-wing refugee in Dallas named Sylvia Odio, left-wing Cuban refugee, was visited by two mercenaries claiming to be Cubans and friends of her father's, and a young American who said very little, whom they called Leon. And they asked her for help raising money. And she was non-committal. A day or two later, their leader, who had called himself Leopoldo, and who I am almost sure was Loren Hall, called her to talk about, as he put it, the American who had been with them. And he asked her if she could help smuggle this American into Cuba, because he was the kind of guy who might take a shot at Castro. He also mentioned that the American, whom he called Leon, had said that the Cubans should have shot JFK after the Bay of Pigs. Again, Sylvia Odio was non-committal and said she didn't know how to smuggle somebody into Cuba. When she first saw Oswald on television after the assassination, she immediately recognized that it was the Leon who had visited her. It took the Warren Commission a long time to get around to her. She gave her story to the FBI less than a month after the assassination, but they dropped the ball. When she finally testified to Warren Commission staffers, among other things, she tried to get them interested in John Martino, but they didn't pick up the bait. I now cut back to Martino and to the Martino household in Miami Beach, where Martino, his wife, and his 17-year-old son, Edward, were news junkies who watched both Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley every night. And one night in the weeks before the assassination, one of the broadcasts made a reference to Kennedy's forthcoming trip to Dallas. I'm sorry, to Texas. If he goes to Dallas, John Martino said, they're going to kill him. I have that from Ed Martino, who came forward with it, not to me, but I've talked to him at great length some years ago. He is now a psychologist and a consultant living in Houston. He's a very responsible guy, and he sat on this for 40 years. But this was confirmed also to two other researchers by Martino's widow before she died. In addition, On the morning of the 22nd, at breakfast, John Martino looked at his son and said, "Ed, you don't look very well to me today. I think you ought to stay home from school. I'll be out working in the garage. Could you keep track of the news and let me know if anything happens?" At around noon, he did let him know that something had happened, and Martino immediately went into the house and began making phone calls around the country, trying to link Oswald to Fidel Castro. Later, he tried to link Ruby to Fidel Castro as well, but this was unsuccessful. Martino died in 1975, but before his death, he talked about his role in the assassination to at least two other men. One was John Cummings, a Newsweek reporter who he had known for many years and who I was able to interview. And he simply said that he had put it together and that any Castro-Cubans had been involved. The other was a business partner named Fred Clausen, who unfortunately was dead by the time I got on the trail. But Clausen had called the House Assassinations Committee late in the 70s and tried to, and tipped them off anonymously about Martino and about this. And Martino told him that Oswald was supposed to have gone to a rendezvous after the assassination where he would have been assassinated and his body would have disappeared. And I am positive that had that happened, there would have been rumors, as there were anyway, actually, that he had been flown to Mexico City and then to Cuba in an effort to provoke an invasion of Cuba. The great irony is that although a lot of the leading figures in the administration did suspect that Cuba was behind the assassination, nobody ever wanted to pursue that. As it was, Ruby had to be recruited, and he stalked Oswald all weekend using his police connections in the in the police station, and he was recruited to kill him. In the mid-70s, when the revelations about the anti-Castro plots first came out, it seemed that the story might break, and the Church Committee, the Senate Committee, was getting fairly close. But Sam Giancana was the victim of a mob hit before he could testify before the Church Committee. That was virtually the same month that Jimmy Hoffa disappeared as well. And a year later, another key mobster in the story, Johnny Roselli, who had confided to Jack Anderson that the mob might have been behind the assassination. He went before the Church Committee, not for the first time, and he finally linked Trafficani to the assassination plots against Castro. He disappeared a month later, and his body was found floating in an oil drum in Miami Beach sometime after that. Lastly, in April 1977, a tabloid reporter called Lauren Hall, the mercenary I've referred to, at his home in California and tried to interview him. And the tabloid reporter recorded the conversation and turned the transcript over to the House committee later. Hall was very abusive and hostile and declined to say anything, but at the end of the interview, he made an interesting remark. Quote, "Hey man, right as it stands now, there's only two of us left alive. That's me and Senator Trafficante. And as far as I'm concerned, we're both going to stay alive because I ain't going to say shit." Trafficante and Marcello both died in bed, but not before they had indicated their role in the plot privately, at least once each. Now, as I say, I had only 20 minutes. I hope I stayed within it, and I had to stress the main points. The book fills in the details on these matters and a great many more, and I'll be glad to try to fill them up in questions. I wanted to see if the truth was out there. I concluded that it was, but I've discovered in this, as in many other controversial issues, while there is a market for the truth out there, it's a specialty market. Thank you very much.
Next up is Professor David Rowan from the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. He's the author of the Zapruder film, Reframing JFK's Assassination, and we're very privileged to have him here. He's a legendary teacher and scholar in Wisconsin and beyond.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks again, Jim Giglio, for putting this together, and all of you at Missouri. Well, I approach this quite differently. I think Thanks, Max. Any assassination, and in particular the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, has two components. The first one is it is a simple murder that must be investigated as any ordinary crime to define the facts. It is largely answering to the question of what happened to President Kennedy. On the other hand, it is simultaneously a political act, a violent change in government that basically answers the question of who shot him. The only clear and solid answer to the imperative who rests squarely on the proper and exhaustive definition of what happened to President Kennedy. Knowledge of the crime shall forever govern the political resolution. In Dallas, the Dallas police gave an almost immediate solution to his murder, as Professor McKnight has so aptly shown us. And within 2 hours, they had announced the arrest of the assassin and named him as Lee Harvey Oswald. But within an hour of the murder, in Washington, D.C. on the Potomac River, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in his office, without his handlers present, in an emotional state, declared to Justice Department officials that a lone assassin had killed John Kennedy, and within 2 hours had identified him as Lee Harvey Oswald. By mid-afternoon, the Secret Service in Dallas had concluded it was a lone assassin. 2 hours and 45 minutes after the murder, Air Force One left Dallas with JFK's body. En route, over its communication system, came the network news announcing Lee Harvey Oswald, a radical and a defector to the Soviet Union, had killed President Kennedy. In the evening, most of the intelligentsia of the Eastern Coast, those are professors, college deans, key newspaper editors, and the like, had embraced that finding. President Lyndon Johnson, in concert with acting Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach and Director Hoover, would, on early Sunday afternoon, conclude that Oswald was solely guilty and agreed on an investigation by men of unimpeachable character to make the evidence show it. Within a minute after the last shot had been fired, police had rushed into the depository building. But incredibly, although they claimed otherwise, they never sealed the building or the plaza crime scene, although the Warren Commission would concur with their top officers by saying that they had not only sealed it, but had closely guarded the building. The head of the Dallas Secret Service, for example, returned to the Dealey Plaza at 1 o'clock, and he went into the depository building, and he found that it was wide open, no guards anywhere. And newsmen and citizens crowded into the building. Roy Truly, the manager of the building, said. And one television reporter had his camera held for him on occasion by police officers as he filmed the search of the 6th floor. In the crowd of the traipsing unknown, evidence could have been tampered with, tainted, or planted, and the culprits could have slipped out. As for the plaza, it was never sealed either. Cars continued down Elm Street. The parking lots emptied. The crowd trampled sites where citizens had reported bullets had ruffled the grass. Not only was the plaza area not sealed, it was neither searched nor protected. There were 2 grassy knolls, 2 parking lots, scores of automobiles, 4 streets, and several grass areas, and a variety of architectural ornaments. The importance of this failure can be illustrated quite clearly. 29 hours after the murder of President Kennedy, a visiting college student on the plaza found 25 feet south of the place where John Kennedy had been hit in the head a piece of his skull glistening in the grass. And he picked that up, and it turned out a forensic radiologist studied that, and by the configurations of the skull and other aspects, determined that it could only have come from an impact from the grassy knoll area, or from the front right. Another illustration was citizens found on the North Elm Street walk a 6-inch long bullet scar, 1/4 of an inch deep, and its trough had lead in it. And that disappears from the evidentiary base. There were only 3 shots in the official scenario, and of those 3 shots, none of them would comport to the location or the nature of that one on Elm Street sidewalk. When the police reached the 6th floor of the Dallas, Texas School Book Depository, they discovered in the southeastern corner a window partially opened, 3 6.5 millimeter shells uniformly laying on its floor 2 inches apart, all with their heads pointed the same way, and a number of book boxes that they asserted the assassins set upon while firing at President Kennedy. Also, they claimed to have found a large paper bag on the floor near the window that they stated the assassin used to hold a rifle dissembled in order to sneak it into the depository. At 1:22 p.m., they searched the 6th floor and they found inside a wall of boxes a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The police announced, as in an epiphany, that the southeast corner was the exclusive site used by the lone assassin. It was a fairy tale. Ballistic tests had not been performed on the victims. Not even the number of wounds or their location or their nature on their bodies were known. Photographs had not been assembled or looked at. In fact, the police, the FBI, and the Warren Commission shied away from those photographs. And some of them were quite important. For example, one by a citizen, a slide, showed that the first shot in the official scenario that hit John Kennedy would have had to have come through the foliage of trees, which could not have happened. What to make of that assassin's lair? The official photograph of the window opening shows a rifle could not have been fired from it and hit the limousine 60 feet below without firing through 2 panes of glass, and the windows were unbroken. Throughout the afternoon, the police calmly raised and lowered the window while they decided on what frame would be best for the official scenario. Tests later showed that the 3 shells had been also inserted and ejected from an entirely different Carcano. Evidence of conspiracy completely ignored by investigating officials. Moreover, the rifle was not swabbed to see if in fact it had been fired that day, nor had the shells been tested to see if they had been fired recently. But the police lab found that Oswald's palm print was indeed discovered on the rifle barrel. When they took off the wooden stock, they said his palm print was there. But the print was flat, the barrel round. More than that, at Oswald's arrest, the police took his palm print for identification purposes, and they took multiple copies of the print, and their number and their chain of possession were never known, and it's quite possible the police could have submitted a duplicate as if from the rifle. Moreover, one of the FBI lab and ballistics experts, now these are some of the world's finest scientists, testified under oath that the rifle could not take prints. And another, a bureau expert in a court case, stated the metal was so cheap and porous, so irregular and poor, it could not take a print. Bizarrely, there were 4 official photographs taken of the assassination, of the boxes on the 6th floor. Of those 4, they're all equally valid as evidence. However, the Warren Commission finally selected one to fit their scenario, but we know from examination of the police photographer Studebaker that the boxes had all been moved before they took the photographs. But more than that, in one photograph he actually snapped his own knee. And additionally, later scientific examination of the bag by FBI forensic experts showed that it had never held the rifle, not at all. And in the Warren Commission there's a marvelous photograph. It shows the area where the bag was found. It's blank, and they had taken a pencil and dotted in the area where the bag was allegedly found. Now, then fingerprint evidence was also involved here, and one of the Dallas police detectives picked up that bag and held it in his hands. There's a photograph of it. At the laboratory, they checked it for fingerprints, and the detective's print isn't found, only Lee Harvey Oswald's one print, and he worked on the 6th floor, so it means nothing forensically. But more than that, they had a select worker appointed to look at anyone who came into the Texas School Book Depository. He came to work about 7 o'clock and watched every worker come in. And he testified under oath that Oswald entered empty-handed. He didn't carry a bag into the Texas School Book Depository. But what they leave out, of course, is his testimony in terms of the bag. But also, they didn't search the adjacent shed. And that's where the workers left their extra clothing and bags and so forth. And in that, they found curtain rods. And those curtain rods are now were found 2 or 3 weeks later. And Oswald's room needed curtain rods, and it seems that 100% of the evidence shows that Lee Harvey Oswald did not in fact carry that rifle into the Texas School Book Depository. Police charged that after the murder, Lee Harvey Oswald fled from his room, which was about a mile away from the depository. His housekeeper stated that at 1:03 or 1:04 he came in at 1 o'clock, and at 1:03 and 1:04, she saw him outside, standing at the bus stop right outside the rooming house. According to the official history, he then walked a mile to the south, and at the corner of 10th and Patton Street was confronted by police officer Tippett, with whom he shot dead with 4 bullets from a .38 that he carried. Now, you have a lot of problems with that, and as far as I can see, it's just an invention by the police. For example, they said Tippett was shot and killed at 1:15, but there are 4 witnesses that become invisible in the police scenario, and later the Warren Commission affirms it, that they won't use them, that said he was dead by 1:06. And Oswald could not have been there by that time. But more than that, the slugs in Tippett's body, 4 of them, they could not be linked to Oswald's pistol. In fact, the evidence on that first slug is clear as a bell. No. More than that, can you connect them to the rifle shells, the pistol shells? The problem with that is the chain of evidence and the integrity of those shells is so difficult to follow. You cannot say one way or the other. But in addition, early critics on the scene interviewed the policeman. That's within the same early the next day, and they said that that pistol was so defective it could not even fire. The police, the FBI lab said that it was not. It had so many weaknesses it could not make an impression on the primer on the shells. But more than that, this idea that he left from his rooming house at 1:03 or 4 and walked to the site of the murder, that's an invention. There is absolutely in the record not one scrap of evidence, I mean none, that he did that. It's inserted. But the police say we have 3 witnesses to the actual shooting. One, Helen Markham. She was a clear, persistent, and dedicated perjurer. That's exactly what she was. The second one had seen Oswald's picture in the newspaper and had then picked him out of the Keystone Cops type lineup that the police had. They had 3 men, young men, in dress suits and ties, standing side by side. Oswald was up there in a T-shirt, needing a shave, had a black eye, and cussing them out. Said, "You're framing me." And why you couldn't pick him out? One witness said you didn't even have to know anything about the case to know who it was. And so it goes. And the third witness they had said he couldn't identify the person. Those are your 3 witnesses.
Maybe we got about a minute here.
That really? Oh no. Oh right. Yeah. But the sum of it all is, I believe it was a conspiracy, and it's conspiracy means 2 or more people shooting, and there was a shot from the front and a shot from the rear that struck Oswald, struck President Kennedy. None came from the depository, and I don't know who shot him, and I don't believe that the evidence was gone into sufficiently so we can answer the what question. And for anyone to say who shot him, I believe, is not good. It's not good. Thank you.
Our 4th and final speaker till we open it up, and I know listening to these you just get more and more questions, and hopefully we'll have time to really have at it here after Max Holland, who is one of our nation's top journalists and an author, editor of Washington Decoded, which is an online publication. He's a 1972 graduate of Antioch College and a contributing editor to The Nation and the Wilson Quarterly. He's written many books. One of the most recent ones is Leak, Why Mark Felt Became Deep Throat. Also recently has done a book called Blind Over Cuba, The Photo Gap in the Missile Crisis. He's in the program as being the lead producer for the National Geographic Channel's documentary JFK, The Lost Bullet, and he's editor of the Kennedy Assassination tapes. And he's currently working on a narrative on the history of the Warren Commission out next year for the 50th anniversary by Alfred Knopf. Max Holland.
Thank you, Doug. I wouldn't blame you all if you're thoroughly confused by now. Before I begin, I'd like to thank James Giglio for organizing this panel. He's very persuasive, and it's hard to say no to him. I want to start by saying I am the dissident here because, despite David Kaiser's modesty, he is a high priest in the Church of the Conspiracy. I often say I'm the skunk at the garden party because I've done this before, including with two of these gentlemen. I'm a defender of the essential accuracy and integrity of the Warren Report. I don't believe it was perfect or flawless, but sometimes I use the expression gewgaw, good enough for government work. I don't believe, as the gentlemen here do, that, as David believes, Oswald killed JFK, but in fact he was going to kill Castro, but that didn't succeed, so he decided to kill Kennedy instead. And behind him was a huge, clanking conspiracy involving dozens, if not hundreds, of people. I don't believe, like David Rohn, that more than 3 shots were fired, and that Oswald fired none of them. I don't believe, like Gerald McKnight puts forward, that the single bullet conclusion was a fabrication, that the Warren Commission was engaged in propagating an official truth, or really an untruth. And I don't even agree with the moderator, Douglas Brinkley, who has blurbed these books and called David Rohn's a brilliant dissection of the Zapruder film, and Gerald McKnight's book as shattering certain fundamental assumptions, and that the Warren Commission was engaged in gross delinquencies. Now, when I do these panels, I invariably have a problem. Do you respond to every serious and nonsensical statement that's been made about the assassination? My feeling is if you do, you're playing to their tempo, kind of like a basketball game. Who sets the tempo? If you respond to everything that was raised, I believe you're lost before you get started, because there's so much nonsense thrown at you, you wouldn't even know which end is up. The fact is, we live in an age of factual trusteeship. In other words, who among you has the time to spend reading 888 pages of the Warren Report, plus the 26 supplemental volumes that constitute the real Warren Report? I dare say maybe one, if that. So you have to trust what's said by us, but I say up is up and they say up is down. So what are you going to believe? My solution is to pick one problem faced by the Warren Commission, a major problem, the exact shooting sequence, to show you how they were both right and wrong at the same time. And if you can understand that, then you can use that tool to also think about the other things that the Warren Commission did and perhaps fell short on explaining. Now, the first conception of the shooting sequence was offered by Governor John Connally from a hospital bed in Dallas. He was there, so he certainly should have known what happened. He was, of course, injured, wounded, almost to the point of death. At the same time, President Kennedy was killed. He offered these observations from his hospital bed, I think about 10 days after the assassination. They were shown on national television during an exclusive interview. They were very persuasive. His explanation was, he heard a shot. He immediately recognized it as a rifle shot. He started to turn to see what had happened to the president, because he immediately thought of an assassination attempt. As he turned, he was shot. Now here you see President Kennedy already reaching for his throat. He's been shot. You're going to see Governor Connally wounded, he said, by the second shot. Very soon afterwards, he slumps back against his wife. And then the third shot sounds, and President Kennedy, of course, is hit in the head. I won't dwell on that very gruesome picture. The FBI, when it submitted its report to the newly formed Warren Commission in December 1963, essentially bought Connally's reconstruction of events. One shot hit the president, the next shot hit Governor Connally, the third shot fatally hit President Kennedy in the head. Now, when the Warren Commission started its work, they too read the FBI report, and for a couple weeks they believed it. Then they realized that there was a problem. The problem is you cannot work the bolt on the Mannlicher Carcano rifle that Oswald used fast enough to get two shots off in the space of time defined by the Zapruder film. In other words, Oswald could not have fired a shot that hit President Kennedy and then worked the rifle fast enough to hit Governor Connally. So what's the solution? Well, either there were two shooters who shot them independently, which would mean a conspiracy, or that bullet went through both men. So when the Warren Commission restaged the assassination in May 1964, they were either going to prove one bullet hit both men or that there had been two shooters. As it turned out, they decided one bullet hit both men. And here's a rudimentary representation of that. And of course, when you think about it, if a bullet entered the back of President Kennedy and exited right above his Adam's apple, right about where the knot of his tie was, where did it go if it didn't hit Governor Connally? That would be a real magic bullet. And anyone who says the magic bullet conclusion is not correct has to answer satisfactorily the question, where did the bullet go if it didn't hit Governor Connally? Of course it hit Governor Connally. Oswald used military ammunition. Military ammunition is made to pass through people. According to the Geneva Convention, it's considered more humane. Also, it's more effective. Shoot one bullet, maybe knock out 3 soldiers on the other side. He used jacketed ammunition. So of course it hit Governor Connally. Here's another representation, much more detailed, of the path of the single bullet. Hits President Kennedy in the upper back, is slowed, starts to tumble because it's hit an object, namely the soft tissue in President Kennedy, enters Governor Connally's back at an oblong direction, still has a lot of force and momentum, shatters a rib, goes through his wrist, and superficially lodges in his thigh. And that was the bullet that was found on a stretcher cart in Parkland Hospital. Now, if this is true, that means one bullet missed because 3 shots were fired. 3 shells were found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and they were not neatly arranged as alleged. 2 were in one direction, and 1 was much closer to the window. So 1 bullet missed. Now, it was a failure of the Warren Commission that they didn't spend enough time on the shot that missed. Because, from their way of thinking, well, it missed, so how important is it? They spent a lot of time proving the single bullet conclusion to their satisfaction, and of course they had a limited amount of time. In fact, they took more time than they were supposed to, and people were getting impatient. What's taking them so long? Lyndon Johnson naturally wanted the report out before the before the election in 1964. Now, the Warren Commission also found something very interesting during the Reconstruction. A Marine, like Oswald was, is taught to aim at the upper body mass, namely the waist to the neck. That is what all good Marines are taught to shoot at. And when they did the reconstruction, to their surprise, they found that the president's upper body mass presented itself to Oswald before the Zapruder film got started. That's why it says not on the Zapruder film here. They called that position A. And if they had followed that lead, they would have realized the possibility that the assassination wasn't captured in full on the Zapruder film. But because of time constraints, they didn't. Now, this is a picture from a Secret Service training film taken 5 days after the assassination. It wasn't to investigate the assassination. It was simply to show agents as quickly as possible what had happened in order to prevent it from happening again very soon. Now, what's interesting about this picture, this is from Oswald's perspective. This is the car in approximately, within a few feet, position A. A very good shot. The president is only about 90 feet from Oswald. Now, what did the Warren Commission do when it wrote its report? It came to the conclusion that 1 bullet had hit both men, the single bullet conclusion, and a shot had hit the president in the head, and a shot had missed. Now, everybody on the commission practically was a lawyer, and they thought that the way to paper up the fact that they didn't have a single explanation was to entertain all the possibilities. Namely, the first shot missed, the second hit both of them, the third hit President in the head. Okay, or the first shot hit both of them, second one missed, third hit the President in the head. Or the first shot hit both of them, the second one hit the President in the head, and the third one, which is at the farthest distance, just missed. And if you actually read the Warren Report, page 111, it goes through each of these three scenarios. The problem is, of course, it didn't happen, you know, it wasn't rewound and to see which way it could happen. It only happened one way. And the American people and critics were expecting a simple explanation. In fact, they got this thing only a lawyer could write and appreciate. Now, as it turns out, the last scenario, that the third shot was the one that missed because it was farthest away, was not true, because most people stated that the third shot was the one that hit the President in the head. So although that was the most natural scenario, it didn't wash. The second scenario, the first shot hit both of them, the second missed because he was firing so quickly, and the third hit the President in the head, was put forward by the commission, and they said, this is possible. We're not saying it happened this way, but it is possible to get off 3 shots in approximately 6 seconds. And this is, to their everlasting consternation, this is where the myth of 3 shots in 6 seconds came about. Now, the Warren Commission didn't say it happened that way. They just said it was possible. Well, the fact is, it was very, very hard to replicate. The best marksman had a very difficult time firing that rifle 3 times in 6 seconds and hitting the target twice. But there was also the first scenario, that the first shot missed. Now, the fact is, and it's ironic, because the only difference between the FBI report of what happened and the Warren Commission's was that the Warren Commission correctly realized that the rifle couldn't be worked that quickly, and so they came up with this analysis. And they're ridiculed for it. This became the point of the biggest one of the biggest points of contention, the so-called magic bullet. And in fact, if they hadn't come up with this explanation, they would have deserved the condemnation and disrepute that they've fallen into. Now, when CBS investigated the assassination in 1967, 3 years later, they were the first organization to determine that Connally had been semi-correct, that yes, the first shot was the one that missed. He did hear a shot, but contrary to what he thought, it missed. It missed everything. It missed the President. It missed all the occupants in the car. It missed the car itself. And when I return after everybody has a second round, I'll tell you what happened to that first shot.
Thank you, Max. And we can commend all 4 of you because you're wading into very difficult and murky waters on this topic, and you all did it very gallantly, and we're all very appreciative, as I speak for fellow citizens, that you're all for taking the time trying to help us reconstruct what occurred in Dallas. I would just say one quick anecdote. I got an opportunity I was writing on President Gerald Ford, and I went out to Rancho Mirage to interview him and have lunch, and he was a very genial man, and I was really there to ask him questions about his presidency, Mayaguez incident or Helsinki Accords, end of the Vietnam War. And he said, come here, I want to show you something. And he had a little group of papers there. He said, you know what that is right here? I said, no. And he said, that's the mail I've gotten about my presidency. He said, you see this stack here? That's what I've just got this week, people writing to me about the Warren Commission report. And he said, that's what people want to know from me. You're a rare bird asking questions about history. We are all endlessly fascinated with what happened in Dallas, and it's only human nature to want to find answers. John F. Kennedy, when he went to my university, Rice, 50 years ago, almost to the day, went to September 12th, so we're close here, the same month, he said we go to the moon because it's there, and it's part of human nature to want to go to the moon. Well, we want answers as humans, too, about what happened at Dallas, and that all four of you are foot soldiers in this regard, and we thank you. Now, we're running a little tight on time, mainly with that keen focus of getting audience participation, so we're going to bring each person back to do two things. Right off the bat, let us know, do you think Oswald killed Kennedy or not? And secondly, to refute information put out here, or to take on one of your colleagues on what you think they may be misunderstanding or misleading us. And we begin with Professor McKnight. If you could come up, use the microphones, because this is being recorded for C-SPAN and other local media outfits.
Now, am I open for questions? I'll be glad to take any you have. Is that what?
Make a few what did you hear today, and what did you want to challenge?
Oh, okay. Well, David, I listened carefully to what David had to say, because that's. I wasn't quite sure of his orientation. I see clearly that his orientation now, and. If I have you right, Dave, you do have Oswald as a shooter, don't you? Okay. The problem I find with that is that there's no basis for that at all. And we could go from there, I suppose. Look, Dave has his thing, and he's done a lot of research. I know he's been down to D.C., National Archives research. Doing research down there, but he doesn't bring in any of the evidence, the physical evidence, the autopsy. In a case like this, even if it was just Joe Banger who was off the street, and you wanted to know what happened to him, probably the best evidence would not be people's memory of this, or that kind of stuff. The best evidence is forensic. In this case, would be the autopsy. And I didn't hear Dave mention the autopsy, the autopsy of John F. Kennedy at all. No, as a matter of fact, I didn't hear it with Max either. That would tell you something, I think, about the shooting, where it came from. And what we have to understand, for example, let me just, I don't go on and on about it, but when that body, when Kennedy's body went to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the doctors there had no political ambitions. I don't know if they voted Democrat, Republican, we don't know. But when they looked at that body, and there were a host of them there, in addition to nurses, they, for example, looked at the neck. He had a puncture wound in the neck. Before they did a tracheotomy over that, they looked at it. Now these are doctors in Dallas. Dallas is a hot ding-dong town. Shooting goes on all the time. Fridays and Saturdays, that place is mobbed with victims of shooting. Okay, these guys see corpses, and they see people with wounds constantly. When they looked at that wound in the throat, they said, not knowing what the official story was going to be, they said immediately, oh, that's a frontal wound. We'll do a tracheostomy over it to relieve the breathing. All of them agreed to that. All of them later on, when questioned, who were in that room, said the back of the president's head was blown off. Blown off. That came from a shot from the front. In terms of ballistics, every one of them, the nurses and the doctors, all looked back there and said there's a massive exodus back over the right ear. Okay, so this is the way they left that situation. If you continue along those lines in terms of Kennedy's wounds, the first one the death certificate that was composed by Dr. Berkeley, who was Kennedy's physician. Now this is before the politics of the case has descended over here. Dr. Berkeley, when he looked at Kennedy and when he had an opportunity at Parkland Memorial Hospital to do a birth, to take a look and write a death certificate, he looks at JFK's wounds, and he has in the report he gives, he has the wound in the back at the third thoracic vertebrae, third thoracic, not cervical. Ultimately, in order to orient politically the fact that a shot came from the rear, that thoracic wound is moved up to the neck. It's a migrating wound. I guess that does happen. Now I don't know of any official account of that happening anyplace else, but that's where it ends when the report is submitted. It is no longer a third thoracic vertebrae. It is a cervical vertebrae. That was important because then this neck wound, entry wound, becomes a wound of exit, because the shooter, and nobody has demonstrated to me that Oswald, neither of these two fellows here, that Oswald was in fact on the 6th floor. The evidence is he was not on the 6th floor. The evidence is he was in front of the building. I won't go into that. But there are people who saw him in the front of the building. And it's too much to go into. But I'm satisfied in my own mind in terms of the evidence, Secret Service evidence, and other evidence of people who were on those front steps. It was Lee Harvey Oswald who was the man in the doorway. I don't know if you know anything about that. Lovelady is the guy that the commission appoints to that position, but it's Oswald. And the reason is because he can't be on the 6th floor and on the 1st floor at the same time. But that's where he was, as far as I'm concerned. Ultimately, we end up with a situation, as Max had delineated here in terms of his view, of 3 shots were fired, 2 hit, 1 misses, has to go downrange to account for a TEG bullet. There is a bullet scar on a curb down under the overpass where Jim Tegg was standing. The Dallas police, sheriff's office were down there. They examined. They said, yes, there's a bullet. That's a bullet smear on that curb. Ultimately, that curve will be patched, okay, before there's any examination of it to see if there's any copper or anything like that. So that there are 3 shots fired, 2 shots hit. And the bullet that is the non-lethal bullet, not the one that hits Kennedy in the head, the bullet that's a non-lethal bullet, 399, that's recovered, it is in virtually pristine condition. A little bit of flattening. And yet that is the bullet that goes allegedly now as the wound is moved up. Even Jerry Ford gets involved in this later on. He'll move the wound up on the back for neatness purposes. As he says, he's caught on doing that. And he said, I just did that for neatness purposes. So we end up with a situation of a bullet that gone through, this is the bullet that will have gone through JFK, will have gone through Connolly, and will blow out his left wrist. There is a hole in his left wrist, and when that bullet ends into evidence, it is in virtually pristine condition. It is a little bit flattened. Now, I will end this. Let me just end it this way in terms of my own limited experience. In 51, 52, I was in Korea. I was in grave registration. Went out, rounded up the early part of the war. The campaign was waged with the Chinese, sending masses of troops to just simply overrun our men in the field. And so you had this incredible hectocomb of bodies all over the place. And so both sides, U.S. and the Chinese, called a truce. And I was with the grave registration people, and I would go out there and help clean up the body. It was incredible. We had little Chinese flags. We put them on the Chinese dead bodies. The Chinese had little American flags, sort of like something out of a liquor glass or something. They put on the American bodies. But when you saw what ammunition can do to people, Now, this is military ammunition. Okay. But still, .399 could not have inflicted those kind of damages on Connolly's wrist and remained in pristine condition. Every doctor who looked at that case, even ultimately the 3 autopsists, or the 3 doctors who, at Bethesda Naval Hospital, 2 of them hadn't seen blood in years. They were administrators. They did the autopsy. And the reason they did the autopsy, because they were military and they were under military control at the time that autopsy was done. And so they didn't do a thorough autopsy at all. They were not allowed to. They were curtailed. So these are some of the problems I have with my colleagues here, Max, and with David, okay?
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you very much. We'll let David Kaiser come in, and he's established clearly he does not think Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. He thinks he was a patsy. But maybe one way expand it a little, David, take on your rebuttal. But also one thing that I've been haunted by, why once Oswald was captured and he was the killer of Kennedy, why when he was interrogated is there no record, tape recordings or writing? I always don't understand that part of it.
All right, that first. There's no tape recording, but there is a record. I've read the record many times. There's a record of the question and answer. Now, there are 2 odd men out in this whole argument. Well, actually, there's one man, me, and a committee of the House of Representatives, and its chief counsel, Robert Blakey, who was a friend of mine insofar as somebody can be a friend who you've never actually met face to face. And we have a number of things in common, but one of them is that we're not liked by either the Church of the Lone Assassin or the Church of the Grand Conspiracy, and they don't quite know what to do with us. Because now, I mentioned the Assassination Committee because they looked very carefully in every way they could into the issues of autopsy, ballistics, where Kennedy and Connolly were sitting, and everything else in the late 70s. There are reports online in several places now. You can read every separate report. And they reached very clear conclusions that yes, Oswald's gun did fire the bullets, that yes, there were only 2 bullets that hit, that they came from the same gun, that they came from Oswald's gun, and that there was no shot that hit from the front. And that's why I didn't feel it necessary to go into all that, and I still don't. Now, all I can say to you, Max, is that it's amazing to me that you're not even willing to confine your criticism to what I said, and that you couldn't resist saying that I was part of the Church of the Grand Conspiracy too, and that, and I quote, you said that I said that Oswald was part of a conspiracy involving dozens or hundreds. Now let me ask for a show of hands in this room. How many people heard me say that Oswald was part of a conspiracy involving dozens or hundreds? Please raise your hands if you heard that. Thank you. I specifically said when I referred to the network that I was not saying that everybody in the network was involved. I named 3 people who I said were definitely involved. I mentioned that every one of those people, to a greater or lesser extent, or more or less reliable extent, admitted that they were involved, and that's all I said. I said there were other suspects, but that's all I said. There's nothing else really that I can say based on what the other panelists said, but I hope I'll have time to take a question or 2 about any aspect of what I said from you all.
Thank you. The other David, come on up. And also, I'm wondering, is there any, going with the 50th anniversary, is there any more footage or photography that's being found? Do you know what are the new artifacts being found from that day, in addition to challenging some of these guys?
I'm not familiar with any, but the old is sufficient. That's all you need. So my basic observation is that Lee Harvey Oswald was not involved in the shooting of President Kennedy. I believe that he was an Orwellian in political orientation. He was anti-Marxist, anti-communist, anti-socialist. He had an intelligence number of 110449, and We know many other aspects about him. As far as I can tell, he's not related to anything devious. He seems always to have been patriotic. But with respect to Max Holland's observations, I've read everything he has written from the 1990s on, and I've gone over them all with fact check, and I must say that they match what he presented here today, and almost every fact he presented will fall upon the most casual reference to the evidentiary base. That this shot here, this single bullet theory, came in June. It came after they couldn't resolve the TEG shot. And to resolve that TEG shot, which was brought forward to the commission by the U.S. attorney in Dallas, to the commission, they had to do it. Someone in authority had said there's another person shot here. So they came up with that single bullet theory. It had been cooking on the back burners for a while, but they did that. But more than that, this depiction of the wounds on Kennedy, this throat wound, during the autopsy, they didn't find it. It's after the corpse had left the morgue. And they phoned Dallas. They were told there was a bullet hole in the front, so the autopsy doctor just put one in. They made it a exit wound, not an entrance wound. But every medical authority, every medical doctor, every surgical nurse said it was an entrance wound. It was about 3 millimeters circle with a bruise ring, and these are experts in ballistics. And his wrist wound, that was from the grassy knoll. This is by Joseph Dolce, Dr. Joseph Dolce, a military surgeon. And the thigh wound is part of the single bullet theory. We know from the X-ray radiologists and so forth that there was no bullet hole in Kennedy's left leg. There was a tiny flake, and we know, and they got around that by not calling the surgeon who looked at it to testify. No, the Warren Commission deliberately, knowingly, willfully were trapped. And I think it's one of the great crimes of history that people don't come forward to defend the Chief Justice. And in terms of them being lawyers, you left out, I believe, one of the most interesting points. They didn't have the adversary proceedings work. There was no adversary present. It was all secret and no one there to question things. And as Wigmore said, the great intellectual, the adversary system of justice is the greatest invention of the human race. And it's missing. And I think that's the Achilles heel of the Warren Commission. I regret I didn't have time to go over each of my esteemed colleague Max Holland's points one by one, but I would love to do it.
The reason I'm asked about new information in the last couple of years, just maybe about a half a year ago now, 6 months ago, they have found the tape on Air Force One going from Dallas to Washington, D.C., which had been edited by the Warren Commission. Now they have the full tape. So there is constant flow of bits and pieces that are coming forward. What they all add up to is another story. Max, you've got plenty to defend, and go for it.
Well, let me just say in response to David, anybody who reads his book, it has a cast of dozens, if not hundreds, of people who were culpable in the assassination according to his analysis. He didn't say exactly that this afternoon, but read his book. Now here's a picture, altered, from the Secret Service. Yes, I have. Here's an altered picture from the Secret Service training film and stills that was made 5 days after the assassination. The ghost car standing in for the presidential limousine is the approximate position within a few feet of the president's car when Zapruder started his camera. Now that's important because it's not generally recognized that Zapruder's film actually has two segments. The first segment of about 7 seconds consists of motorcycle policemen driving by. And film in those days was precious. Plus his camera was hand-wound with a spring. So when all he did see was motorcycle policemen driving by, he stopped his camera. And he waited until he was sure that the president was in view. This is frame 132 from his film. This is frame 133. The car is much further into Dealey Plaza than was commonly understood. He never pretended that he had filmed the car making the whole turn. In fact, if you read his testimony, he said he only heard 2 shots. So my explanation for what happened, and it's not shared by everyone, of course, is that Oswald, being the good Marine that he was, fired a shot before the Zapruder film started, or restarted, to be technical. Because Oswald fired at the upper body mass. Now, interestingly, there were 2 witnesses, one way back here and another at the other side of this architectural feature in Dealey Plaza, who said in their very early statements to the Dallas authorities, when the first shot sounded, the president was passing a black and white highway sign. Now, this sign is no longer in Dealey Plaza. It's the old U.S. highway badge signs, black and white. So, what am I saying here? Oswald fired a shot when it was suitable for him, because you have to remember the Zapruder film mesmerized everybody to the point where it became the representation of the assassination. You can't think of the assassination without seeing it through Zapruder's eyes. But of course, Oswald had no idea Zapruder was there. He had no communication with him. He didn't have a walkie-talkie and said, "Abe, are you ready? I'm going to start shooting." He shot when it suited him. And therefore, the first shot was fired before Zapruder restarted his camera. Now, what does that mean in terms of an explanation? The first shot missed, I believe, because it hit that mast overhanging Elm Street. That would account for the jacket separating from the lead core of the bullet. And several witnesses said they saw something strike the pavement at the moment the first shot sounded. Then the lead core goes down into Dealey Plaza. It hits this concrete skirt around a manhole cover. Other witnesses said there was a burst of dust around that skirt. And then it hits this curb that was referred to earlier, where a witness named James Tague was standing nearby. And he had some blood on his cheek, either from a piece of concrete from the curb or possibly the lead core. And that's what I believe happened to the first shot. Now, what's the importance of that? If the timing is as I believe it is, that means Oswald fired 3 shots in a little over 11 seconds, which is eminently doable, easy for even a Marine of his riflemanship. So what am I trying to say here? I believe the Warren Commission missed an opportunity to present a clear, convincing, single explanation of what happened. Now, I talked to several of the Warren Commission staff members. Some of them are indifferent to this explanation. They say, well, we got the shots that hit the president correctly. And yes, they did. And you can't dispute that. But if they had identified what happened to the first shot, then there would not have been none of this 6 seconds in Dallas business, which is a meme that people still remember. And there would have been an explanation that would have been persuasive about the shooting sequence. Now, of course, that doesn't explain all the other problems and issues that have to be gone into. But I'm suggesting that it's a way of looking at the Warren Commission. You cannot impeach their findings, even if I'm correct. It doesn't impeach their findings. It improves on their findings. And that is the way to look at the Warren Report, because it has never been impeached, and it never will be. Thank you.
We're going to have questions in a moment if you'd come up to the microphone. And I just want to get, we're hearing both David Kaiser and Max Holland. You both are saying that you believe Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy. He would seem to be of a one on the big issue, but there's a bad energy between you two. And what is it, Max, that you feel that David is mispresenting? And David, what is it that you feel Max is, since you both on the seminal part of Oswald being the killer are on the same page?
Well, there are two important questions on the assassination. First, who killed the president? Who was responsible for the shots fired in Dealey Plaza? On that, David and I agree. The second question, though, is even if Oswald did the deed, did he have help? Were there people behind him? Was he part of a larger conspiracy? That's where we differ. David went through all the records, or many of the records at the National Archives. I tip my hat to him. But he concocts information when he wants to. He resorts to some of the things that Jim Garrison dredged up in 1967, the Rose Chimmery incident. And to give you an example of how he ignores information when it doesn't suit his purposes, Lee Harvey Oswald tried to kill a right-wing general named Edwin Walker in April 1963. Now, from Oswald's perspective, killing a general who he thought was an American Hitler and killing President Kennedy was not all that big a stretch, because both represented American imperialism and a threat to Castro's Cuba. But for most Americans, of course, it had a lot of dissonance. Walker and Kennedy. Well, in David's book, he says he really doesn't understand why Walker would be a target of Oswald. And to me, that's a fundamental void, misreading of Oswald. He presents Oswald as a cipher, completely devoid of any motivation, designs of his own. Anybody who reads about him, and they're very good books, including one by Norman Mailer about Oswald, you can't treat him as a cipher.
Can I respond to that?
Let David get it. Response. Then we will. And get in line, guy. Anybody, we'd love to get some questions. So just stand up there if you could.
All right. One of the things that you have to understand if you're going to be a serious historian about anything is that just because a crazy person like Jim Garrison believed a certain piece of evidence doesn't mean that that evidence is false. I didn't say anything was true because Jim Garrison said it was true. Everything that's in the book, and those points that Max is talking about aren't critical to the main argument anyway, but I stand by what I said. Anything I said was based on the original evidence as it appeared. And I made very clear what I thought about the Garrison investigation, which is pretty much what Max thinks about it. I'm sorry, what was the last point you were making was, oh yes, about Walker. Yeah. Actually, I had some new information about it, which is in there. I'm not so sure that Oswald tried to kill Walker. I'm sure that Oswald shot at Walker. I will say that if Oswald had attempted to kill Walker with the same determination that he attempted to kill President Kennedy, Walker would have been dead. Oswald just fired one shot, didn't hit him, and apparently ran away. It is a mysterious incident open to several possible interpretations, but I'm not going to try to spin that out now. Again, I'm willing to let my use of evidence be judged by any impartial person. There were many times in the course of writing the book, in the course of writing the research, when I found myself kind of grinning to myself and thinking, gee, if I wanted to prove that the CIA or Lyndon Johnson was behind this, I could do a better job than anybody else has. But I didn't, because that isn't what I thought. Oh yes, as for Oswald being a cipher, I don't think that's really what I said. I do think Oswald is an extremely enigmatic figure. The problem, well, no, what happened was that I discovered as I say, that Oswald's whole performance in New Orleans with respect to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee fit perfectly into what the FBI was trying to do to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee at that time, namely to discredit it and portray it as a communist front. And I found a couple of other things which I want to mention because I thought they were highly significant. A day or two after the assassination, an assistant director of the FBI wrote a memo on what we're doing about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And he talked about the COINTEL program that they were running, how they infiltrated it, how they were trying to start feuds within it, and how they were trying to discredit it in the press. And that's what Oswald did. He successfully established, wittingly or unwittingly, if you will, by his radio appearance in New Orleans, that it was really a communist front and that he had been to the Soviet Union and so on. But anyway, now, so that memo laid that out. A new copy of the memo was prepared for the Attorney General on what we've been doing about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It was the same memo about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, but the COINTEL program, part of it, was left out. Second thing, 12 years later, 1975, the Church Committee is looking into COINTELPRO in a big way, and the FBI tells them a lot about how it was done. And for instance, that they discredited the Du Bois Club in some southern city by founding a fake chapter of the Du Bois Club, exactly what Oswald did with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And the FBI submitted a list of targets, but they left out the Fair Play for Cuba Committee from the list of targets. That was in 1975. I don't think I'm a chronically suspicious person, but I can't help but think that maybe somebody at the FBI was worried that it might open up some unpleasant avenues of investigation if they were to open that up. Again, as to who was involved in that, as to who might have been in that, there's a lot more in the book. There's one figure actually in the book who had been a staffer for the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. Briefly, he had been a university president in Dallas. He ran his own anti-communist organization. And his name is Dr. Robert Morris. And some evidence came to light after the book came out that linked him very closely to Lauren Hall. And there are other things, and he's somebody I'm a little more curious about with respect to the counterintelligence efforts that Oswald might have been a part of. The other thing is, read the letters Oswald wrote to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, to the Communist Party of the U.S., to the Socialist Workers' Party, trying to make contact with them, and see how they responded to them. And it is clear, A, that they thought this guy was nothing but trouble, and he was probably an infiltrator, and B, that they weren't going to have anything to do with him. And that's what happened with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New York. He wrote a letter saying, I want to start a chapter. And the guy said, well, you're in a very dangerous place in New Orleans, and I wouldn't get too out in the open, and I wouldn't rent an office. And Oswald writes back and says, well, I did go ahead and rent an office, and I hope to do good work from the cause. And that's it. I mean, Ted Lee in New York, the head of the committee, he sizes it up. This guy has nothing but trouble. I'm not going to have anything more to do with him. And he doesn't write him. And in the same way, when he shows up in the consulate in Mexico City, trying to get into Cuba, he presents his evidence of his Fair Play for Cuba Committee activities to Sylvia Duran, who's a Mexican working in the Cuban consulate. And he says, see, I'm this great friend of Castro. Let me into Cuba. And as she explained to the House Committee, she's sitting there thinking, this isn't right. This isn't the way Americans do it. Americans go to the Communist Party headquarters in New York, and they get vetted there, and I hear from the Communist Party headquarters from New York, and I'm ready with a visa when they get there. And so she tells him, I'm sorry, I can't help you, but maybe if you get a visa to go back to Russia, I could get you a visa then, and so on. So that's the kind of thinking I've done. I didn't start with an agenda. I wanted to see what I could find. And I was very surprised by how much I did find and the patterns I found that this fit into. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go. Thomas, do you have a question there in the front? Go ahead and start it off.
I do. I want to commend you for trying to make sense of this complex issue. I think if we stayed here all day, we would not get through half of what you raised. And with that in mind, I'd like to address my comments to Professor McKnight since you opened us up. You started with the 707 flying to Japan over the middle of the Pacific. And part of the conspiracy theory analysis is that one reason that the assassination took place when it did is that it was done at a time when a significant portion of the senior cabinet was away. Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury Dillon, and you go on the list. One problem with that, and I'd like you to comment if that's what you're trying to convey, is that we know from the records that the Japanese, in effect, set the time when they could actually sit down and engage in a trade mission. So if there's conspiracy, are you suggesting that the Japanese are involved in some way? Secondly, you also talked about the timeline. Well, there are logs of flash traffic that come in, and from what the record indicates from both Rusk and Dillon, who disagree with each other on what should have been done, they agree that they didn't know what was going on first. They debated for some time what was to take place. I don't remember the exact time that the messages came in. The second message was the one that indicated that not only was the president hit, but that he was mortally wounded. And it's at that time they decided to turn around and fly back. So I'd like you, in other words, are you saying that all these guys on the plane were also in some way, shape, or form involved in a conspiracy? Please.
You can stay here. Okay.
Oh, I don't forget.
We only have a few minutes, so.
No, I'm not saying that at all. As a matter of fact, I was not even considering putting that in a sense. I wanted to get to the fact that in Dallas itself, Oswald's in the frame 20 minutes after the president is declared dead. There is something maybe one could say here, is that the Air Force One tapes, which would include Lyndon Johnson leaving Dallas and coming into Andrews Air Force Base, there's still a lot of back and forth. I think there were 4 circuits going on that plane, and what we have right now maybe is 40% of what was said. There is being held by somebody. This is Clifford. Clark Clifford, who was not Clark Clifford. I can't think of Clifford's first name. Was LBJ's was LBJ's assistant, World War II veteran, a wonderful record, all that. When he died, he left the entire transcript of what took place on Air Force One, which, if we get it, if we ever do get it, it becomes public. It should be very interesting, because it may say something about Lyndon Johnson. Who was he talking to, for example? Was he insisting that Kennedy's body not go to excuse me? That Kennedy's body that Kennedy's body go to Bethesda Naval Hospital, because there he will get a military autopsy, and that would mean it would be a controlled autopsy. Okay, that would be important. I think Doug Horn has done a lot of work on that. But I wasn't implying anything here. I was just sort of filling in color material, and it would be interesting to know when this group with Gene Rusk and Manning and the rest of them on that flight going to Japan, exactly what time were they told that the suspect in the case was Lee Harvey Oswald, a defector to the Soviet Union. I don't know when that was, but I do know when the Dallas police had Oswald as the man in the middle, and that was at 1:40 Central Standard Time, and that's just 20 minutes after the president was. That's a significant document. That's 20 minutes after the president himself has died. Could I add one other thing in terms?
We're going to have to take the last question.
Okay.
We're
All right.
on minutes here. We're going to have one last question, and then I'm just going to ask each person on the panel just one title that they wish people would read, not one of their own books, but one other. Last question.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the panel. My question has to do more with, in 2 cases, I've had people tell me, or in the conversation about the assassination of Kennedy, who do you think killed Kennedy? And they would say, President Johnson. Now, here's my question, though. I don't even want to argue that he did that. But this ties, Professor Brinkley, to your discussion of Walter Cronkite, trust. To what extent did the assassination of President Kennedy and the Warren Commission and maybe its failings impact the trust that the American people have of their government, and how is that evidence of why we're having this panel here today? And going back to Marines burning the thatched roofs in Vietnam and that being aired, could the assassination and the investigation of that assassination have laid the groundwork for that failure of trust that has occurred between the citizens and our government?
That has Max Holland written all over it, since he's got a book on the Warren Commission coming out.
Well, that's a very good question. There's no doubt that there's a direct relationship between the loss of trust in government and the Kennedy assassination. If you look at all the polls, for the first 2 years after the Warren report came out, the trust level remained high. But by 1966, with the war in Vietnam and people, mostly from the left, picking at the Warren report, and some inexplicable things, that the shortcomings of the report, which I didn't have time to get into, that's when, I mean, people believe if the government can't tell the truth about this, you know, what else is it hiding? But let me just say this. I was driving down here, I was listening to Jacqueline Kennedy's Conversations, just released a couple months ago, and she talked about how the first dinner outside the White House was at the home of John Sherman Cooper and his wife Lorraine in Georgetown. And you might not remember, but John Sherman Cooper was on the Warren Commission. He was the Republican senator. He was such an honest politician that the first time, 2 times he ran for Senate, he lost because he was so terrible a politician. But when he was appointed to the Senate, he became beloved by Kentuckians, and he was a very esteemed member of the Senate and a personal friend of President Kennedy. Now, anybody up here who says that the Warren Commission was corrupt, incompetent, I submit to you, how do you explain that someone with John Sherman Cooper's integrity would be part of something corrupt or incompetent? He never renounced the Warren Commission.
May I talk to that? I want to talk to that.
Here we have the last word. You can stay there. Here's the
diametrically wrong.
Last word right here. We got to go. I'm getting cuts.
Chief Justice Warren himself didn't believe in the Warren report. He said so after it, and Lyndon Baines Johnson said so in the White House and afterwards. And John Sherman Cooper and Richard Russell, 2 members of the Warren Commission, did not believe it itself. And Hale Boggs, a member of the Warren Commission, and yet another, they didn't believe in their own commission report. 4 out of 7 didn't believe it. But I think Max has been studying it so long, he's a victim of a Stockholm syndrome.
I'm going to stop. It's like Charles Sumner in the Civil War. We don't want a caning to begin here, so we will call it an afternoon. Thank you all, and thank the panel.
Good job, guys.
President John F. Kennedy.
Next on American History TV's The Presidency. This November 22nd marks 49 years since President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The Warren Commission, which investigated the assassination, concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone in shooting the president. Oswald was himself shot and killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby. Numerous other theories have persisted since 1963. Now, a panel of historians talk about what they think happened in Dallas. This 2-hour program was part of the Mid-America Conference on History in Springfield, Missouri.
Well, welcome. It's wonderful to be the moderator for the Mid-America Conference on History session dealing with the Kennedy assassination with really 4 of the leading lights who have been trying to get us to understand what is the biggest murder mystery in U.S. history. It's fitting that we're here with, and the founder of this conference, James Giglio, has written the seminal book that we use in colleges on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. part of the University of Kansas Press's series on the presidency, and it's a book he constantly updates. So James, thank you for doing that. And I also might add, this is very timely. Unlike a lot of history topics, I don't have to explain to you what the Kennedy assassination was, nor probably do I have to remind you, but I will, that we are rapidly coming upon the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in November of 2013. I suspect you're going to be seeing a lot of talk about 50 years later, because like Pearl Harbor or 9/11, it's one of those moments that anybody alive that's alive today that was alive in '63 has it's the moment they heard about the news, and people have stories, and it's endlessly fascinating. Already books are coming out this November by popular television host and a scholar dealing with the Kennedy assassination. I think we'll find more and more. So we're very lucky to have these scholars here today. The protocol we're going to do is I'm going to call them up.
Who were, for example, on an airplane and were heading to Tokyo for a conference. Back in Washington, there were only 4 cabinet people left there. MacNeil-Lehrer was one, Bobby Kennedy was another, and then there was the Gronsky and another fellow, minor figures. The rest of them were scattered across the world. Now those in the Air Force plane that was heading toward Tokyo for a conference, that included the Secretary of State, his assistant Robert Manning, Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, were in that plane. Accounts of these people tell us that while they were in that plane, what they don't tell us is the time, is that they were alerted to the fact that the president had been shot. Not only had he been shot, but they were also told that the one who shot him was Lee Harvey Oswald, who had been to the Soviet Union, and he had done this. Now, I wish lovely to know exactly what time that happened. The president, as you know, in terms of Central Standard Time, was killed about 12:31. I think is when he was shot, 12:31. Declared dead at about 1:10, something like that. Pierre Salinger, though, in writing his account, also contributed to the Kennedy Library a manuscript, and in that manuscript he indicated the time on that plane they learned about this information. That manuscript is in Harvard. I went there. It is missing. It is gone. Nobody knows where it is. Back in Washington, D.C., things happened rather quickly. At 3:40 Central Standard Time, Abram Chavez, State Department legal counsel, received a call from Acting Secretary of State George Ball with directions to gather, quote, together the files in the department on Oswald, on Lee Harvey Oswald. That was at 3:40 Central Standard Time. He then tasked Mr. Chavez to be sure that he had on his desk the next morning a report on what the State Department had on Lee Harvey Oswald. Now we get to the more specific indicators now of how fast this thing developed. At 12:45 Central Standard Time, 15 minutes after the shooting, the first, I'm not sure of this, and I won't say it, I'd ask Dave Kaiser about it, is I think some indication that maybe the first time the American people heard of Lee Harvey Oswald, his name, it may have been from Walter Cronkite, who was broadcasting at that time, but I may have to go back and wait till David Kaiser is able to nail that down. I don't know. In any event, so that is just simply an opening, setting up, I think, the spirit of the times. Now, what happened here next was it was absolutely important to find out that this description of the shooter that Sawyer got, that description of the shooter came from a physical source. And so while Sawyer could not satisfy us in terms of the name of the person who gave him this description, very quickly that name will surface. And it'll be the name of Mr. Brennan. He is the commission's star witness for placing Oswald in the frame for shooting JFK and Governor Connally. Even though, as I will go on a little bit more, even though the Warren Commission had no credible evidence ever that Brennan was ever able to pick Oswald out of a lineup, and I'll explain a little bit of that a little bit later as I move ahead here. Now, but even more specifically, and this is a document I don't think has been revealed yet, in terms of putting Oswald in the frame. Before any police had any forensic evidence against Oswald, at 1:40 on 11/22, Oswald was pronounced, JFK was pronounced dead about 30 minutes before this. An arrest report cited Oswald as the man, quote, the man who shot and killed President John F. Kennedy, police officer Tippit. He also shot and wounded Governor Connally. And if anyone wants to see this document, I have it up here.
One at a time, according to the program order. They're going to have about 15 to 20 minutes max to talk. Then after all four have their say, I'm going to go back in the same order and allow each gentleman 20 minutes. I'm sorry, 10 minutes. And at that point, I might ask a couple of questions, and then we'd like to open it up to Q&A from the audience. We have, as you can tell from the program, 2-hour session here, so we should be able to get at some of the questions. All of us wonder what happened. All of us are fascinated about the Warren Commission and Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. I, in a previous talk today, spoke on Walter Cronkite and how people absorb the assassination via television. There are just hundreds of thousands of different ways to look at this tragic event. And let's begin. I'm going to call up Gerald McKnight of Hood College. He's author of Breach of Trust, How the Warren Commission Failed the Nation and Why. And this is an ongoing inquiry for him. He's working on a manuscript right now, a new book dealing with the Kennedy assassination for Kansas. So please, Professor McKnight.
Thank you for coming, and I hope it's going to be worthwhile. I'll try to do the best I can. I want to begin this way. Actually, what I'm going to do is, in brief overview, is to try to give you a sense of Lee Harvey Oswald's last 45 hours on Earth, okay? Now, to begin with, I just want to begin this way, and that is to try to make as clear as I possibly can how quickly Oswald was put in the frame, okay? As the assassin of the president, the assassin of Officer Tippit, and the man who wounded Governor Connally. Now, some of this would have been very interesting in some ways. So I don't have specific information, but we do have accounts, for example, of the Kennedy cabinet people. A Dallas lieutenant inspector by the name of J.H. Sawyer, with 23 years in the department, was on the police radio with a description of the shooter. That is in the that source there is in the FBI Lee Harvey Oswald file. And the description came this way. He was a white male, approximately 30 years of age, slender built, 5 foot 10 inches, and about 165 pounds. Well, that wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald. And that he had a rifle, and that it looked like a .30-30 type Winchester, but no description on what he was wearing. So my question would be, that's interesting. Because if you become that specific and then cannot describe what he's wearing, it suggests you didn't know what he was going to be wearing getting up that morning before the event occurred. an indication of something that would require, I think, clutching at this issue again and thinking it through. But we'll leave it go at that. But what is equally more interesting is that Sawyer, a 23-year veteran on the police force, never was able, the source gave him that. He said somebody came up and told him that. But he never got the source's name. 23 years in the Dallas Police Department, and he never got the source's name. Now, Oswald, at this particular time, was 24 years old. He weighed 131 pounds. And according to Dr. Rose, who did his autopsy, he was 5'9" in height. Okay, so when he died, when he was killed himself on Sunday, those were his vitals. He had no description like that on the top. Although there is, interestingly enough, there was a CIA file. They had several files on Oswald. One was called the Lee Henry Oswald file, and in that file, the dimensions you get for this fellow, for the Lee Harvey Oswald in this file, was that he was 165 pounds, he was about 30 years old, and he was about 5'10". That's sort of interesting. If anybody was asked me about that later, maybe I can explain that at a little bit more length.